Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Kelly, and I want to welcome you to our webinar, Implications of iOS 10 on Mobile Forensics. We have a great session planned for you today by Bruce Hunter. He's our forensic analyst and instructor here at Black Bag and one of our resident Mac experts. We'll start off the presentation with some changes you can expect since iOS 10 was released, followed by some encrypted backup issues troubling our customers, and ending with mobile device management solutions. After the presentation, at the end of the webinar, we will be taking questions, so please feel free to type up your questions in the questions box throughout the webinar. Without further ado, I will turn it over to Bruce.
Thanks, Kelly. So we're, just like Kelly said, we're going to be looking at some forensic implications of iOS 10. We're going to look at what has happened in the landscape since iOS 10 has come out, and how it's going to affect you, in particular in acquisitions, how it's affecting the acquisitions of an iOS 10 device. So we'll start talking about that, and we'll go from there. And let me just kill my webcam here, and then we'll get going if I can. Doesn't look like I can. Oh well. Okay, so we'll just go on from here. So we'll talk a little bit about iOS 10, what has happened in iOS 10, what has happened in iOS 10 since then, and what we're looking at as we go forward. So the landscape has really changed since September 13th, 2016, when Apple released iOS 10 to the public. Now, some of you may have seen iOS devices running iOS 10 prior to that because Apple had allowed public betas to occur, and public betas actually started coming out as early as July. But since then, as of this week, approximately 73.6%, or as near as can be to 75% of all iOS devices are now running iOS 10. Apple reports that this is the fastest adoption rate so far of any new iOS operating system, which is kind of significant for us. Now, the highest adoption rate is on iPhones, needless to say. And the reason for this, it's estimated that approximately 40% of all iPads that are out there right now currently cannot upgrade to iOS 10. So speaking of what devices are capable of running iOS 10, let's have a look at what devices are capable of running iOS 10. Those are the iPhone 5 and newer, the iPad 4 and newer, iPad mini 2 and newer, and the iPod Touch 6 and newer. These are the only devices that are capable of running iOS 10. So as a result, with this drastic reduction for iPads, where it only goes down to iPad 4, you're not able to you're seeing fewer iPads that are going to come in with iOS 10 than what you will with iPhones in particular. So let's have a quick look at some of the forensic implications of iOS 10. We're going to talk in this section about iTunes and OS 10 and how this is affected mainly again with acquisitions of iOS devices and connecting an iOS device to your computer. We're going to talk a little bit about acquisitions. We're also going to talk a little bit about lockdown files or pairing certificates of iOS devices and how this has affected us as well. Obviously, getting data off that device, just actually connecting to that device, is a huge issue in the forensic world nowadays because, simply put, it's very difficult. Lastly, we're going to look at encrypted backups, and as we said earlier, we've also added on MDM, or mobile device management devices as well, so we'll talk about that. Now, this first sort of issue that we're going to talk about really affects Mac users more than Windows users. And that is that on a Mac, if you are going to be using Backlight or Mobilize on a Mac, you need to have the latest version of iTunes installed on your computer. That currently is 12.5.1 or above. And how is this affecting your forensic analysis is this. The lockdown certificates, or the pairing certificates of the iOS device, are located at a folder called Private var DB Lockdown. That folder is now protected in the Apple operating system. So what's happening is iTunes is protecting that folder. The way it works is this, as you know, when you plug an iOS device into a Mac or a PC, the first thing it does is it checks to see if that device is unlocked. If you enter the passcode to unlock that device, you're presented with an option on your phone to trust this device or not trust this device. For forensics purposes, we click trust because we need to gather data from that device. No data can be gathered from that device unless a trust is established between the computer and the device. iTunes has the permissions to access the private VARDB lockdown folder. So as a result, once you select trust, iTunes can then reach out to that lockdown folder, find the pairing certificate for that iPhone, then connect to that iPhone and exchange data with that iPhone. If you're using Backlight or Mobilize, and Backlight or Mobilize is not in a trusted state, or you're not running the latest versions of Backlight or Mobilize, what would happen is you will have an unlocked iPhone connected to your Mac, and at the same time, your Mac will be showing you that the iPhone is locked. So in other words, the forensic tool will say, the device is locked. But in fact, the device is not locked. And the only reason for that is because Backlight or Mobilize is not able to access that lockdown folder because it's protected. Now, fortunately for us, Backlight 2016 R 2.1 or Mobilize 2016 R 1.1 have now fixed that issue. And now we have a situation where Backlight or Mobilize will ask for the administrator's password for that computer to access that locked folder, the private DB lockdown folder. Now, this will allow one-time access to the folder to gather the data that it needs. So in other words, what will happen is when you hit the trust button, Backlight will then go to that private VARDB lockdown folder, access that lockdown file, and then allow the exchange of data between an iOS device and the computer. So you can either do it on a one-time basis through Backlight by selecting putting your password in and then clicking OK, or you can navigate to the folder private VARDB lockdown, select Get Info, and change the permissions for your administrator account to read-write that, to be able to read-write in that folder. Now, that may occur for an extended period of time, but until the next time you update iTunes, which will probably then change those permissions right back again. So you will lose the permissions that you once had. So again, just something to keep in mind that if this is occurring, you have to make sure you have the most recent version of Backlight and Mobilize installed if you're using a Mac. Just on the side note of this does not affect Windows users. So in other words, Windows users will not have this issue because iTunes is not protecting the folder in Windows as it does with Mac. Now that leads us to the lockdown files and the changes that Apple has made to these lockdown pairing certificates that are on your computers. We know for a fact that in the past, we've been able to use pairing certificates to unlock locked iPhones and iPads. Essentially speaking, when the device connects to the computer, it writes this lockdown file to the computer in the location. On a Mac, private VARDB lockdown; on Windows, private data, Apple computer lockdown. In those folders, those directories, you will see plist files that are named for the iOS device that created that plist file. So for example, it will be the UDID or unique device identifier of the device with a plist file. Now the issue is, in the past, is we've been able to collect those lockdown files and then put them on our forensic machines and gather the data off of a locked iOS device. This is not the case so much anymore because now we have to enter the passcode when the device has been turned off or restarted, the device has not been unlocked for the past 48 hours. Both of those have been in place for quite some time now. But this is a brand new one that has just been added as of May 2016 and started with iOS 9.3. And that is where the passcode has not been used to unlock the device for the past 6 days. So in other words, you were using Touch ID for the last 6 days. And Touch ID has not unlocked the device in the last 8 hours. So in other words, you've continuously been unlocking the device for the last 6 days using your Touch ID, but within the last 8 hours, the device has not been unlocked with Touch ID. If that is the case, you need to put the passcode in. Obviously, the last two have also been around for a long period of time. A remote lock command has been received, or after 5 unsuccessful fingerprint attempts, you need to put the passcode in. So in other words, Apple is basically covering all the bases on protecting the data on the iOS device. They're making sure that everything is being secured. So once we get past the screen lock situation, and we can actually access the device with a forensic tool, we now have to look at how iOS 10 has changed the methods of acquiring data from the iOS device. And this has actually changed quite significantly. In the past, pre-iOS 8, so in other words, from iOS 1 to iOS 7, we had 3 methods or more of connecting to iOS devices to obtain a logical data dump of an iOS device. 1, we connected using backup data. 2, we connected using Apple File Conduit. And the last one was File Relay. So we were able to connect under those 3 different circumstances to gather various amounts of data in a granular kind of method. Prior to the release of iOS 8, Apple had responded to reports in the media that file relay was a method that hackers could obtain data from iOS device. Unfortunately, it was also the method that most forensic tools connected to iOS devices. So what Apple did was shut off file relay. So then that made us lose numerous files that we were able to get prior to iOS 8. So we're now being reduced in the number of files that we can get with our actual logical images of iOS devices. Then iOS 8.3 came along, and with iOS 8.3, what Apple has done is they hadn't shut off Apple File Conduit, but what they did was they protected certain files from Apple Conduit from, in other words, being able to gather those files. These directories are most commonly found in mobile applications where the specific developers have turned off file sharing for those files. So in other words, if particular developers were protecting those files or being allowed to protect those files, and as a result, Apple File Conduit could not collect the data from within those files. With iOS 10, Apple has actually shut off Apple File Conduit. This means that there are lots of directories and files that could at one time be accessed using AFC, and we're no longer able to access those files using iOS 10. So basically, what is Apple File Conduit? Basically, it is a package that is put onto an iOS device and allows access to the file system through a USB connection. Now, keep in mind, that has to be through a USB connection. There are all sorts of talk, and there's lots of talk about jailbroken iOS devices. Jailbroken iOS devices can still have AFC turned on, and they are using a slightly different package than what everybody else was using, in that they were using something called AFC2, which is basically an enhanced version of AFC that allowed access to the file system through USB on a jailbroken phone. Sadly, at least as it stands right now, there is no jailbreak for iOS 10, so you cannot access it through AFC2, and there is no jailbreak, so we can't access any further data than what we were presented with right now. So basically, iOS 10 has shut off AFC. And what this does for us is it affects some files that are found in a bunch of paths. Most of these paths are found within the media domain of the device. So you're going to see media DCIM, iTunes control, recordings, photo data, photo streams, downloads, photos, and even mobile applications, where we're actually going to see fewer files gathered from these particular directories. Now, when I say that we're not able to gather data in some situations from such, for example, mobile media DCIM, that doesn't mean to say that you're not going to get pictures. You're still going to get all the pictures. Those are still available. But what it means is that there are potentially files that could potentially be saved to that folder that we may not be able to access. One area that's really impacting is in mobile media photo data. Over the years, we've been doing a fair amount of research on photos for iOS and iCloud photos for iOS and Mac computers. And a lot of data is stored within the mobile media photo data library. So now there are databases that we were able to connect to and download from, located in these locations that are no longer available or accessible to us. So we're losing some of the data that we once had. This makes it more and more important to ensure that we are collecting every potential piece of evidence, because I look back to that second or third slide that we had in at the start when we talk about 40% of iPads are no longer able to upgrade to iOS 10. The data, we may not be able to get the data off of the iPhone, but mirrored data may be on an iPad that the person has, or potentially on a Mac or a Windows machine, because you can use iCloud Photos on Windows as well. So gathering that data from these other devices is really important. Another thing that's affecting iOS acquisitions is the user turning on encrypted iOS backups. If the user has set within iTunes to encrypt the backup, they will actually provide a passcode that is not necessarily the same passcode as what the user had to unlock the actual phone. So in other words, with a phone, you may have a 4 to 6 digit passcode to unlock your phone. With an encrypted iTunes backup, basically you can put anything down as a password. It could be a word, alphanumeric, whatever you want that you can set for the passcode for it. In fact, in some Apple documentation, they actually recommend that the passcode be different than the passcode to unlock your actual iPhone. What this means is that when this setting is set, the iPhone itself is set to make encrypted backups. So in other words, it's coming directly from the iPhone. This cannot be changed from the iPhone. This can only be changed from within iTunes. And the only way to change this is to enter the password. So in other words, if you connected it to another computer and asked iTunes to back up this iPhone in an unencrypted state, you would have to enter the encrypted password in order to force iTunes to create an unencrypted backup. So how does that impact our examinations? Well, in other words, if you connect a device to Backlight or Macquisition or Mobilize, sorry, and request an acquisition of this device using Backlight or Mobilize, Backlight and Mobilize are going to prompt you for the password for the encrypted backups. If you don't know the password for that encrypted backup, what's going to happen is you will not get decrypted data, meaning you won't be able to read the data. So if you don't know the backup password, the data is going to be encrypted, and it has to be decrypted in order for it to parse. So otherwise, you're not even going to be able to parse that data and see potentially what's in there. Now, there are tools that are out there that will allow for brute force attacks on encrypted backups. And you can use those tools to decrypt these backups and then bring those decrypted backups back into Backlight or Mobilize. Now, there is a little bit of good news here, and that is that there have been plenty of blogs and reports recently about iOS 10 backups, that Apple actually lowered the encryption strength on these backups. They've actually made the encryption weaker with iOS 10 backups. Apple has obviously responded to this and have basically said, well, you know, we are going to fix this with the next release of iTunes. So I'm assuming at some point in time, as soon as Apple releases the next version of iTunes, which I think just came out, you will actually, with 10.12.1, there was a new release of iTunes. I'm quite sure now you'll probably find that the encryption scheme used to create encrypted iTunes backup is much more strong than what it was before. So there is a side note to this, and the side note is this, that what we're finding is that if an iOS device is set to use an encrypted backup, and you know the password for the encrypted backup, the acquisitions are actually providing a little bit more data than what they would have normally if the computer was set not to do an encrypted backup. So what we're seeing is we're seeing a few more files that are occurring within our acquisitions. In fact, iTunes actually provides you a little bit of a hint. If I just go back one slide, you can actually see it. And it says, this will allow account passwords, health, and HomeKit data to be backed up. So in other words, iTunes is actually telling you that if you click on encrypted iPhone backup, it's going to back up some additional files. And that is in fact what we are seeing. So they are seeing a little bit more encrypted files being brought over when encryption's turned on. The last thing I want to talk about is a significant one, in particular for people who are working in the private sector. And that is the implications of mobile device management software. There's lots and lots and lots of mobile device management software out there. Apple even provides one free of charge called Apple Configurator. And with that, you can deploy iOS devices to either a person, singular people, or groups of people, and set policy on those devices by including certificates on the device, which actually will force the iPhone or the iOS device to act in a particular way. With these policies or certificates, you can actually force encrypted backups from the device. So in other words, you actually can tell the device, doesn't matter what happens, you must provide an encrypted backup. You can also turn off applications or functions such as cameras, music, iCloud. You can put other restrictions on the device. All this is going to impact your investment analysis, because when you start looking at the device, it may explain for the disappearance or the non-availability of data on that device. So in other words, you may look at a device and say, well, why is there no pictures found in the DCIM 100 Apple folder? Well, there's no pictures in there because the policy has dictated that the camera has to be off on this device, so they can't use the camera. So there's all sorts of options that can be turned off and on, such as camera, Siri. You can allow, you may not even be allowed to create backups at all, depending upon each individual certificate or policy that's put in place. Now, one thing that you can talk about with policies and certificates is you can always potentially remove the policy or certificate from the device. Now, that's not always as easy as it sounds. Obviously, if you are doing that, what are you doing? Well, you're making changes to the device. So it's something that you're going to have to do with a little bit of sort of foresight into what potentially may or may not happen later on down the road. The bigger issue is that these policies or certificates quite often are protected by passwords. So in other words, you can't just say remove the policy from the iOS device. You need to have a separate password in order to delete that policy. So again, you're coming back to the whole situation of gathering all that information. So this could restrict your imaging of the device, because simply put, if it's set to force encrypted backups, you may not know that password. You may have to make really good friends with the IT person who has deployed these devices. The last thing I want to talk about with relation to mobile device management are something called supervised devices. Supervised devices are devices that are deployed under much more strict policy than just a regular MDM software that is sent out. A supervised device can actually not back up at all to any computer except the computer that deployed the supervised device. So basically, the iOS device tracks the UDID and the MAC address of the computer that deployed it and will only back up to that device. So you may have everything. You may have the passwords, all the backup passwords and everything, and still not get a backup of that device. So again, this is another way that these type of things are going to be affecting your cases going forward. Needless to say, people who are examining managed devices may face hurdles that are not seen with normal devices. So in other words, if you've seized a device under normal criminal investigation, you may not have this. The biggest thing that you have to remember to do in this situation is try and find out who the administrator is and get that information. Otherwise, you're not going to get that data. It's really important. Now, Apple has, how has what I just talked about affected iOS 10? Well, iOS 10 is making it more and more easy for mobile device management software and administrators to supervise and protect devices. It's obviously because Apple has figured out that, you know, we can make a lot of money selling these phones to businesses, which makes sense. So as a result, the restrictions that can be placed upon these devices and the amount of granular restrictions that can be placed on these devices is increasing. So as a result, you may see even fewer bits of data found in your acquisitions of these devices. So if you have any questions, obviously you can contact us at blackbagtech.com. You can send messages to analyst@blackbagtech.com. We have some other information listed here, and I'll turn it over to Kelly for a few minutes.
Thanks, Bruce. So we only have 2 questions for you so far.
Sure.
The first question is, are there lockdown folders? Are they locked on Windows?
So the lockdown folder itself is going to be exactly the same on Mac and Windows. The difference is, and I think the question is iTunes protecting the lockdown folder on the Windows computer? No, it is not. The iTunes right now is only protecting the lockdown folder on the Mac computer. So right now it's putting restrictions on that Mac computer so that private VAR-DB lockdown folder is protected. On the Windows side, that's not the case.
Okay, the next question we have is concerning iCloud backups. We discussed iTunes backups, so the question is, are they or can they be encrypted? If they are, how do you encrypt those, and what is the best approach to obtain an iCloud backup?
So iCloud backups are encrypted by default. They never used to be, they are now. So you can obtain an iCloud backup through, there are tools out there that are going to allow you to download iCloud backups. I believe Elcomsoft has one. There's other tools out there as well that allow you to go out and connect to the cloud. Now there's issues with this as well. You are essentially connecting to the person's iCloud. Apple is also instituting two-factor authentication. So that means that gathering that data might be a little bit more difficult because you are essentially connecting to that person's cloud account, which means that that person is going to be notified that you're connecting to their iCloud account. Two-factor authentication also means that if you are connecting to the iCloud account, a message will be sent to a trusted device. If that message is sent to a trusted device, it has a code on that trusted device that you must enter in order to access the iCloud. So again, it's making it more difficult to access this stuff. So using a separate tool is going to help because it's going to be able to allow you to gather that data from iCloud. However, it's one of those things that you may be kind of stuck with, in the sense that if you have access to it, the user is probably going to be notified.
Okay, and this is kind of a follow-up to that. You kind of covered this already, but what can you get in iCloud that you can't get in iTunes backup?
Basically, they're almost the same. You have to remember what an iTunes and iCloud backup is for. The idea of an iTunes and iCloud backup is essentially that if your device has crashed or there's been an error with your device, or more importantly for Apple, if you're transitioning to a new device, that you can quickly restore your device back to a running state. So basically an iTunes and iCloud backup will only back up what it needs to in order to make the device actually run. So in other words, just to get enough stuff out there so that we can actually restore the device to a running state. A lot of stuff it can automatically download. So things like music, is iTunes in the cloud. Pictures, you have iCloud as well. So it's only going to back up the pictures that it hasn't already backed up. It's only going to back up application data that it needs to. Otherwise, it can just re-download all the apps from iCloud, or it can re-download all the apps from the App Store. It does not need to back up everything. So there's really not a whole lot of difference between the two. There may be some additional log files that are backed up in iTunes that are not backed up in the cloud.
Perfect. So with this question, a few people have asked, is there a difference in terms of extracted evidence between processing an iTunes encrypted mobile backup with the known password versus direct extraction from an iPhone?
So direct extraction from an iPhone is going to get you a few more files, and that's only because of the fact that what is happening with an iTunes backup, as I said, is they are essentially incremental backups. So basically, you're only going to get files that are needed, that have to be backed up to restore the device. We are forcing a full backup of the device, so you will get everything that we can actually lay our hands on. Really, right now, as it stands with what we're left with, we are not getting nearly as many files as what we were when we had Apple AFC turned on. When AFC was turned on, we were able to get a lot more files. Those files are specifically SQLite databases and log files that we're no longer able to access. So, whereas before, in the past, iOS backups done through iTunes and logical examinations done through a forensic tool were very, 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 there was a huge difference between the two. Maybe 2,000 to 3,000 files. We're probably down to about 200 to 300 files now.
Okay, we had another question. Let's see. Someone wanted to know if there was any reason at this point to hold off on updating a Mac workstation to iTunes 12.5.1.
If you're trying to do a forensic analysis on an iOS 10 device, you are going to need the newest version of iTunes. So because it contain essentially, Macs don't use drivers, but for lack of a better term, it will request the drivers from iTunes, and we use those to access the iPhone. So as a result, you're going to need the newest version.
Okay, and do you have any suggestions if you cannot get the iTunes backup password? Are there any options, for example, if a victim that provided her cell phone, she couldn't remember what the password was?
Yep, the only options at that point in time is strictly a brute force attack on the actual iTunes backup. Now you can create dictionary attacks. Some of these tools will provide dictionary attack capabilities. We're finding that, and in fact, I think some of the tools have indicated that cracking iTunes 10 backups as it stands right now is much faster than what it was with iTunes 9 backups. So iOS 9 backups were a lot slower. So the only option you have at that point in time is using brute force brute force attacks, essentially. So, and that's actually a really good point. What they made is in fact, quite often what happens is that a person will set that backup password and not realize that that's happening, because every time they plug their device into iTunes, it just backs up, because simply put, the password is actually stored on a computer. On a Mac, you'll find it found in the keychain. So it's actually contained within the keychain of the Mac. So iTunes just goes out, checks for the password, grabs the password, unlocks the phone. Simple as that. And that's the way it works. So it's not constantly pestering the person. So it is very possible that that's the case. So if it's a victim of a crime, you can certainly ask for as many passwords as they can provide you. Write those down and use those as part of a dictionary attack. But other than that, you're simply left with some sort of attack on the actual device itself or on the actual backup itself to gather the data.
Great. Another question is, should both an encrypted backup be created of a device and an unencrypted backup if options are presented?
So should an encrypted backup and an okay, so the big thing about that is if you have the ability to turn off and on that encryption on the device, you are going to get more data from an encrypted backup than what you will from an unencrypted backup. In fact, on the exact same phone testing that I've done on a particular phone just yesterday, I found that I got a whole 17 extra files, not a whole lot, but 17 extra files from the encrypted backup than what I got from the unencrypted backup. So again, it's one of those ones that you have to weigh. Most of the information that you're going to find on an encrypted backup is dealing with HealthKit and HomeKit. And that's what I found. And they are usually found in the mobile library preferences folder. This is where the largest percentage of the files are found that are not on an unencrypted backup, that are on an encrypted backup. So in other words, that's where you're finding most of those files. And again, they mostly deal with HomeKit and HealthKit. So again, it's one of those ones that you have to toss back and forward.
Okay. Would copying the lockdown folder and parsing it using alternative software provide you with the user's password in iOS 10?
I've never known anyone been able to decrypt the lockdown folder and get that out. Now, I think that they can do it. You certainly can point to it, but the problem with the lockdown files themselves is that they actually are expiring as well. So regardless of what all happens is you can attack the lockdown file itself for the particular device, but that is still not necessarily going to get you into the actual phone, because it's not a sense that the lockdown file is not allowing you to decrypt the phone. What's essentially happening is that when one of those conditions that I talked about earlier is not met or has reoccurred, what will essentially happen is a new lockdown file is actually laid down, or an updated lockdown file. So what basically happens is creating a new one with a new certificate. The other one that was not on that list, that is something that you have to be mindful of, is that lockdown files now expire after 6 months. So if the lockdown file is more than 6 months old, if all of those other conditions have been met, in other words, in normal circumstances you can get into it with all those other conditions, but the lockdown certificate itself is 6 months old, the lockdown certificate is no good. So each time the iPhone connects and you are hitting trust, and even when you're not, as soon as you put the passcode in, it is updating that lockdown certificate. So in a sense, it could be very difficult to access it, and you would be pretty lucky if you managed to crack the lockdown certificate and get into the iPhone.
Okay, since we're getting a little long on time here, I have 3 more quick questions and then we'll wrap it up. One more is, since iCloud backups are incremental, is there a way to request the backup to assure you get a representation of the entire image?
Yeah, because they're incremental, you will actually be able to see, the last time I pulled one off of iCloud, you were able to see the different dates and times of the backups. In fact, on your iPhone itself, if you go through and look at your backups within within the iCloud setting of the iOS device, you can actually see the dates and times of the previous backups to the cloud. That's actually how it is stored in the cloud. So you will be able to gather the data over a particular period of time. So again, writing a warrant or subpoena to Apple and requesting this information may be able to provide you with a full picture of the iOS device over a period of time. So again, that's a really good point, that you can grab it for a specific date and time as well.
Okay, and then this is more of an opinion question. In your opinion, do you feel that Apple will continue to make things harder for us?
Well, I think it's heading that way. For example, currently iPhones are running HFS plus case-sensitive file system on them. Next year, Apple promises to bring out Apple File System. Apple File System is going to amalgamate all Apple devices under one file system. There are some encryption techniques that are involved in Apple File System that are will pose definite problems for investigations. I think that right now the way the trend is the trend is heading toward more and more encryption and much more difficult to get evidence off of these devices. I think security is important. Every time one of these celebrities gets their devices hacked, that's the first thing everybody talks about, is the security of the device. And of course, Apple's in the business of selling products, and they want to make sure that the products are as secure as it can be. So I think that's what we're faced with.
Great. And last question, just kind of shifting gears. The question was, is the MDM listed in the device's applications?
On the actual device, it probably will not be listed in the actual device, because the MDM management solution is actually a Windows or Mac program on a Windows or Mac machine that deploys these devices. What you will end up seeing is a profile saved to the device. That profile is the certificate that manages the MDM. Now there is, under user settings, there are plist files that will tell you what specifically has been enabled or disabled within that device based upon the settings set up by the user or the person who deployed the device. So there is a plist file that tracks it on the device, but it doesn't say what type of management software. It just says this is what's available and this is what's not available.
Okay. And then finally, people were wondering if they would be able to get a copy of the webinar. I just want to let everyone know that you'll get a recording of the webinar in the follow-up email once the webinar concludes. But if you have any more questions or are interested in a trial version of our software, please feel free to contact us. You can also learn more about our products at blackbagtech.com. As you can see, we have several trainings coming up, so check out the training section of our website for more information. We'll also be attending a lot of upcoming conferences for the rest of the year, so if you're attending one, please stop by, because we love meeting all of you in person. And I just want to thank everyone for attending our webinar.